Hi everybody! How are you all doing today? Misty Summer here. So, today everybody is a National Day of Mourning in Canada called Truth and Reconciliation Day. So, in Canada, in a little while ago, there were a number of schools called residential schools. And basically, what happened in these residential schools is settlers, the European settlers, would take children to these schools and and assimilate them into what at the time they called the perfect Canadian. So basically into what they called Canadian basically or European. So they weren't like allowed to do anything. They were like weren't allowed to dress in their traditional clothes. Only did this to First Nations and Indigenous, by the way. They weren't allowed to dress in their traditional clothes. They weren't allowed to speak their indigenous languages or whatever language they spoke, for that matter. And they weren't allowed to be indigenous, basically, because the Europeans that came thought like, oh well, being indigenous is wrong, and like, oh, you have to be European, like indigenous are second class, but they took them to these residential schools, and if their parents didn't want them to go and held them back, they would take these young indigenous and First Nation kids by force, and they would do this because they wanted everyone to be just like them. They didn't want any like differences in anyone. They just want everyone to be just like them. So they took them, and a lot of like pain and torture happened within those residential schools. That it was like um it was sorry, because I can just try to find the right words. It was horrendous and horrific what happened in those schools, and I'll get to how we know that these schools happen in a second. But it's something that kind of like, I guess, the government at the time tried to cover up, like, oh, we're making this all better. Like, this is gonna be fine. It's gonna be fine. Like, we're turning everyone into just like us so that everyone is perfect, or what they thought at the time was perfect. And they took these kids from their families with force and tortured them. Um, they treated them like second class and taught them how to be European at the time. And just last year, or sorry, I'll get to that later, but they would hurt them if they did something wrong. They would beat them if they did something wrong. They would use these methods of pain and torture to turn them into Europeans, to assimilate them. And these schools ran for a long time, like 26 years. Sorry, not 26 years. They ran for a long time. I don't have the exact date, but they ran for a long time. They were shut down about 26 years ago. So that's quite recent. Shut down 26 years ago. And that was the very last school that was closed. So we recently, like last year, there were discoveries in like all in Canada of these mass graves, and they kind of like when they found these mass graves, it was very horrific, and it was like they brought these children to these schools, these residential schools, and kind of sorry, taught them how to be European, which they already forced them out of their homes. They did not come willingly. Some of them did. Well, yeah, they didn't come willingly. They were forced to come. They were tortured and beaten if they did something wrong, and a lot, a lot of indigenous children um, died at these schools. And I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but a lot of these indigenous children died at these schools. Their families would never see them again, and you just send them away basically when they were going to residential schools. You never knew when you were going to see them again. And for those lucky enough to see their children again, they probably did not recognize them because they had been assimilated and they looked different. Like when they arrived, it was mandatory to get their hair cut, like have a haircut, by the people on staff there at their schools. So they didn't know any of their culture. They weren't even at the schools. They weren't allowed to talk about the culture. They weren't. They didn't know their culture anymore. They knew European culture, and they were like, sorry, they were like completely changed. They didn't speak their language anymore because they hadn't been able to speak it at those residential schools without fear of being tortured or beaten or just went through pain. So they were like unrecognizable basically. They had been transformed into Europeans, and they lived at the schools. They didn't just. It wasn't like most of our schools where you go for the day and then come home to sleep. No, it was like um, you stay during the night and you sleep in these like you sleep in beds at the school. Like you don't see your family or your parents for months on end. And then when you go out of the school, you're what they call the perfect European or perfect Canadian or whatever. Um, so recently, like last year, they discovered mass graves of the from the residential schools, and as y'all can tell, today I'm wearing orange in support of the First Nations. So Truth and Reconciliation is we first have to get the truth out. So we acknowledge that this is what we did, and then we have to try and make amends for what we did. And there's absolutely nothing in the world that can make amends for what what we did as Canadians to these poor Indigenous and First Nations people. But we have to show that we have to try and make amends in any ways we can. So, yeah. So I thought I would just quickly come on and share that with you guys. So, yeah. But it was just and they keep discovering graves to this day too. They just keep finding these mass burial sites of these Indigenous and First Nations children, and it's just it's sorry. it's completely like, I'm not even gonna say that, but it's just terrible what Canadians have done to the Indigenous First Nations, and yeah. So I just wanted to pop on to YouTube and tell you all that about Freedom and Reconciliation Day a little bit. So yeah, we honor that we are on the First Nations land and that this is now dying. Because when Europeans came in to Canada, the Indigenous and First Nations were already living on the land, but they took, or we took, everything from them. We took their land, and we forced them to live where we wanted to. Basically, we just took over their homeland and forced them to live where we wanted to. So, yes. Give me a second. Earlier, are you calling me? Okay. So yeah, it's just absolutely horrific what happened in these residential schools. And we all know this. It's just a fact by now. That we can never make amends for what we did to these First Nations children and just First Nation in general. But yeah. Hello, how are you guys? How are you doing today? Sorry guys, let me just quickly enlarge the chat for myself. So I didn't have an orange shirt towards I. Don't worry, don't worry. Glad that you're doing good. Glad that you're doing good. And just quickly talk about what has happened. So after the era of these residential schools, sorry, just a sec. So after the era of these residential schools, about last year, we started to discover these mass graves of Indigenous and First Nations children. And it's just, personally, as a human and as a Canadian, it's just, sorry, it's just absolutely horrific what happened to them in these schools. It's like school is and even just us taking their land was like a blow to them because it was like, you come in here, we were here first, and you take over our land and tell us where we have to live. That's what happened. And it's just so I can't even use the word mean because it's so much more than that. It's so oh my gosh, just a sec. It's so harmful. I'm gonna use that word. It's so harmful and just like mean that we did that to them and we put them through that suffering. Because inside these residential schools, they suffered for like months on end, and would never be the same again after these schools. So I'm gonna look at the chat now for a little bit. Yeah, it was super sad. It is super sad. I'm glad that you got to chance to learn about it in school. It's very important. I'm I, I'm also sorry. I'm just going up in the chat. I'm glad that you also made a poster too. Yeah, so actually thanks for bringing that up. So even like just only having 4 years, imagine this. You're just 4 years old and you get taken away from your family and everybody that cares about you and sent to these schools where you never knew if you would ever see your family again. And it was like you could die in these schools potentially. You could never see your family again. And that's what happened in these residential schools. Treated like they were treated like animals. They were treated worse than animals. Sorry. They were treated worse than animals. And we all, or back then, they thought that we as Europeans were above them, higher class. But so we bullied them. We did immense bullying on them. We did so many terrible things. And yeah. Yeah, some if you were a girl or or even a boy and came to these residential schools, you would have a haircut. You would have a mandatory haircut from the staff of the residential school, and some so as sorry just a sec, as Lobsang said, they got would have their hair washed with gasoline sometimes, and it it's just so horrific. So I just wanted to do a quick live stream pop on here to do that. Yeah, they also thank you. I love saying in the chat there. They also they weren't so well. All the teachers, priests, nuns at the school were treated like royalty. They had all the best food. They they had a lot of money too, but they failed these kids. They failed indigenous children. They failed First Nations. They they failed as settlers on the land because usually you're supposed to respect the people that and they literally came in, took their land, didn't even ask, didn't even like, oh, can we have a piece of your land? No, they just took it all. And yeah, so I'm gonna just quickly before I go on here, I just want to quickly say a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we're hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We honor the presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. We acknowledge that this land does not belong to us, and that we are guests on this land. Yeah, the last school did it. It wasn't even that long ago too. The last school closed, um, and it still greatly affects them to this day. So I agree with Love saying it still greatly affects them to this day. It is, and I know some people will be like, oh, like, that's like a gone thing. We're all way better now, but we're not. So, sorry, we we treat the indigenous better, but we're still we still sometimes sometimes forget that we are guests on this land. This land is not ours. It belongs to the First Nations and Indigenous, and that it's just sorry, everyone. It's just we have to reflect on what we did and how. And as I said before, we can never make amends for what we did, but we reflect on what we did and we make sure that that never happens again. And that we also have to treat the indigenous way better. Even now, we still have to treat the indigenous way better. There are whole indigenous reserves that do not have clean water. And it's not that they can't get it. Is that the government refuses to give enough money to these places to get them clean water. There are some First Nations reserves and indigenous reserves that are under a boil water advisory, which means you have to boil your water before you can drink it to make it safe. And personally, I just think that that is terrible. That you have to turn on your tap and fear that it could have something in it. You have to boil your water and fear that it could still have something in it. Yeah, I agree. It will take a long time to recover from this. The residential schools love saying. I agree. So I'm going to. So thank you all so much for joining the live stream. And I know I'm sorry if you are not in Canada and watching this live stream. It's just something that I thought was I personally and I every single day I think that this is important. And we shouldn't only have Truth and Reconciliation Day 1. We should have it every single day of the year because we need to reflect. We need to do better as Canadians. We need to do better as settlers on the land to respect and honor the First Nations. So, thank you all so much for joining the live stream. I'm going to be heading on over to Twitch now to do a singing stream. Maybe, I'm not sure, but I'm gonna head on over to Twitch probably later on today to do a singing stream. And yeah. So I hope everyone has an amazing day. And remember that if you're Canadian, remember that this land does not belong to us. Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.